Wyoming Territory, 1877. The bitter December wind howled across the open plains, rattling the shutters of Yates Xander's modest cabin like angry spirits seeking entrance. At 25, Yates had already lived enough frontier hardship for several lifetimes. He stood at the frost-covered window, his strong jaw tightened with tension, a steaming mug of coffee warming his calloused hands. Fresh-faced despite the harsh conditions that had claimed so many around him, he still maintained the athletic build of a man who spent every day in the saddle. 3 years he'd been out here, building something from nothing. 3 years of isolation had taught him one undeniable truth. The frontier was a place for survival, not connection. His parents had learned that lesson the hard way. Their love story cut short when fever took his mother and grief slowly hollowed his father. Yates had sworn then that he would never make the same mistake. He would build his ranch, secure his future, and do it all without risking his heart. "You're a fool, Yates Xander," he muttered to himself, watching his breath fog against the glass. The letter had been a moment of weakness, a response to an advertisement he'd seen in a tattered newspaper months ago. Mail-order brides for lonely frontiersmen. He'd written it during a particularly cold night last winter, sealed it before common sense could prevail, and sent it off with the next supply wagon. By spring, he'd convinced himself it had been lost or ignored. Then her response had arrived 2 months ago. Beatrice Whitman of Boston, Massachusetts, 20 years old, educated. Coming west to marry a stranger because her family's financial collapse had left her with few options. The photograph she'd enclosed showed a young woman with serious eyes and light brown hair arranged in a simple but elegant style. Beautiful, yes, but Yates had immediately regretted his impulsiveness. What business did he have bringing a city woman out to this unforgiving wilderness? He'd written back explaining his change of heart, but the stagecoach driver had confirmed yesterday that a young woman would be arriving on the Christmas morning coach. His letter of rejection must have crossed paths with her journey west. Now on Christmas Eve, Yates paced his cabin like a trapped wolf, dreading the morning. "She'll take one look at this place and demand to return east," he reasoned aloud, his voice sounding hollow in the empty cabin. That would be for the best. A woman like her had no place in his hard-won solitude, no place in a land where attachment only guaranteed heartbreak. The night stretched endlessly as snow began to fall, blanketing his small homestead in silence. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold. Yates had barely slept, his mind racing with all the ways he would explain to Miss Whitman that their arrangement had been a terrible mistake. He'd hitched up his wagon before sunrise, prepared for the 10-mile journey to meet the stagecoach in the small settlement of River Bend. As he approached the town's single street, lined with a handful of rough-hewn buildings, Yates saw the stagecoach already waiting. His stomach tightened, too late to turn back now. The driver, a weathered man named Hank, nodded in greeting. "Right on time, Xander. Your passenger's inside the trading post, warming up." Yates dismounted stiffly, brushing snow from his coat. "Hank, this is all a mistake. I wrote to tell her not to come." "Well, she's here now," Hank said simply. "Traveled all the way from Boston, been on the trail for weeks." The trading post door opened, and Yates felt the words die in his throat. Beatrice Whitman stepped onto the wooden walkway, her figure silhouetted against the morning sun. She wore a dark blue traveling dress beneath a heavy wool coat, her light brown hair tucked beneath a sensible bonnet. She was smaller than he'd imagined, more delicate, yet she stood with perfect posture despite what must have been an exhausting journey. Their eyes met across the distance. Hers were the color of summer sky, a blue so clear and bright it seemed impossible in the dead of winter. Yates opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to end this before it began, but no words came. Beatrice approached with measured steps, her gloved hands clutching a small carpet bag. "Mr. Xander," her voice carried a hint of Eastern refinement but also a surprising steadiness. Yates cleared his throat. "Miss Whitman." He managed that much, but the carefully prepared speech had abandoned him entirely. "Merry Christmas," she said, her eyes taking his measure with remarkable composure for someone who had traveled thousands of miles to meet a stranger. He swallowed hard. "I tried to write you. To tell you not to come." Her expression didn't change, though something flickered behind those blue eyes. "I see. Well, that explains why you look as though you've seen a ghost." A small, determined smile curved her lips. "Nevertheless, I am here now. Perhaps we might discuss matters somewhere warmer." The trading post owner, Mrs. Henderson, had emerged behind Beatrice. She shot Yates a look that could have melted steel. "Yates Xander, you aren't thinking of sending this poor girl back on the next stage after she's come all this way. On Christmas Day, no less." "No, Yates fumbled, trapped by circumstance and the expectant gazes of everyone present. "Of course not. Please, Miss Whitman, my wagon is this way." As he loaded her trunk and helped her onto the wagon seat, Yates could feel his carefully constructed solitude crumbling. This woman did not belong here, with him, in this life. And yet, as they pulled away from River Bend, the silence between them seemed to hold something unexpected, a question neither was ready to ask. The 10-mile journey back to his homestead stretched into an eternity of awkward silence and halting attempts at conversation. Beatrice sat beside him, her posture rigid despite the rough terrain, occasionally stealing glances at the vast expanse of snow-covered prairie surrounding them. "It's beautiful," she finally said, her breath forming a small cloud in the cold air. "Different than I imagined, but beautiful nonetheless." Yates nodded stiffly. "It can be. It can also kill you without warning." "Most beautiful things carry danger," she replied with unexpected wisdom. He studied her profile as she gazed across the landscape. The photograph hadn't captured the determined set of her jaw or the intelligence in her eyes. She was more striking in person, with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her circumstances. "Miss Whitman, I should explain." "Please," she interrupted, turning to face him fully. "Before you continue, I would like to say something." When he nodded, she drew a deep breath. "I am aware that this is unconventional. I harbor no romantic illusions about our arrangement. My father's investments failed last year, and he passed away shortly after. My mother followed him 3 months later. I have no brothers, no inheritance, and my relatives made it quite clear that my continued presence was a burden they could not afford." Her frankness startled him. "I'm sorry for your losses. As am I for yours. You mentioned your parents in your letter." The reminder of that letter, written in a moment of loneliness he'd spent months regretting, made Yates uncomfortable. "Yes, well, things have changed since then. This land is harsh, Miss Whitman. My ranch is small, the work never-ending. There are no comforts, no society. It's no life for a woman raised in Boston." Her blue eyes remained steady. "With respect, Mr. Xander, I believe I should be the judge of what life suits me. I did not travel all this way seeking comfort or society. I came seeking a future on my own terms." As they crested a small rise, Yates' homestead came into view. It was modest but solid, a cabin built of sturdy logs, a small barn, a corral for the horses, and the beginnings of what would someday be a proper ranch house. Smoke curled from the chimney where he'd banked the fire before leaving. "That's it," he said, unable to disguise the pride in his voice. "Not much to look at, but it's mine, every log, every nail." Beatrice studied the homestead with thoughtful eyes. "You've accomplished a great deal for a man of 25. How did you—" "You mentioned your age in your letter." A smile touched her lips briefly. "I have an excellent memory, Mr. Xander." As he helped her down from the wagon, their hands met, and despite the layers of gloves between them, Yates felt something unexpected, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the cold. He quickly released her and busied himself with the horses. "We should get inside," he said gruffly. "Storm's coming." The sky to the northwest was darkening ominously, the sure sign of another blizzard moving across the plains. Beatrice followed him to the cabin door, her carpetbag clutched in one hand. As Yates pushed open the door, he was suddenly, acutely aware of how sparse his living quarters were. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves holding the bare necessities of frontier life. "It's warm," Beatrice said, stepping inside and removing her bonnet. Her hair, freed from confinement, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. and very tidy. Yates remained in the doorway, uncertain. This woman, this stranger, had upended everything in the space of a morning. The worst part was, he couldn't even bring himself to be properly angry about it. Something about her calm determination had caught him off guard. "Mr. Xander," she said, turning to face him. "I believe we have much to discuss, but first, might I suggest we observe the holiday? It is Christmas, after all." From her carpetbag she withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought this from Boston. It isn't much, but where I come from, one doesn't arrive on Christmas without a gift." Stunned, Yates accepted the package, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy against the paper. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the cover embossed with his initials. "I had it made when I received your letter," Beatrice explained. "You wrote about keeping records for your cattle. I thought perhaps this might be of use." The thoughtfulness of the gift left him speechless for the second time that day. In 3 years, no one had given him anything for Christmas. The last gift he'd received had been his father's watch, pressed into his palm as the older man lay dying. "I have nothing for you," he admitted, shame coloring his words. Beatrice's smile was gentle. "You've given me shelter on Christmas Day, Mr. Xander. That seems more than fair." As the first snowflakes of the approaching storm began to fall outside the window, Yates realized with startling clarity that his solitary life had just irrevocably changed. The question was whether he would fight against that change or find the courage to embrace it. The blizzard struck with unexpected ferocity, trapping them in the cabin for 3 days. What might have been an unbearably awkward situation gradually evolved into something different as they established cautious routines. Yates insisted on sleeping in the barn despite Beatrice's protests that he would freeze, and each morning he returned to find she had already stoked the fire and prepared coffee. On the 3rd day, as wind howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, Beatrice stood at the window watching the swirling snow. "Does it always last this long?" Yates looked up from mending a bridle, "Sometimes longer. Last winter we had a storm that kept me snowbound for nearly a week." She turned curious. "Figure of speech," he said quickly, "just me and the livestock." Beatrice studied him with those perceptive blue eyes. "It must be lonely." "It's peaceful," he corrected, though the word rang hollow even to his own ears. "No complications." "Is that why you wrote to me? Because you were seeking?" "Complications?" There was no accusation in her tone, only genuine curiosity. Yates set down the bridle, considering his answer carefully. "I wrote to you during a moment of weakness. The winter nights get long. A man starts thinking foolish thoughts." "Foolish," she repeated softly. "Is that how you view companionship, as foolishness?" "Out here, yes," he met her gaze directly. "This land takes more than it gives, Miss Whitman. I've seen it break stronger men than me. I've seen it claim women who thought they could tame it. I have no interest in taming the land, Mr. Xander." Beatrice moved away from the window, her skirts rustling against the rough floorboards. "Nor do I harbor illusions about the difficulties. But I wonder if perhaps you've been alone so long that you've forgotten there can be strength in partnership." Her words struck uncomfortably close to thoughts he'd buried deep. "You don't know me," he said, more harshly than intended. "No," she agreed calmly, "just as you don't know me, yet here we are, thrown together by circumstance and choice. The question is what we intend to do about it." Before he could respond, a crash from outside sent him hurrying to the door. The wind had torn a section of the barn roof free, and snow was pouring in on the animals. Without a word, he grabbed his coat. "Stay inside," he ordered Beatrice. "It's too dangerous out there." But when he struggled through the blinding snow toward the barn, he realized she was right behind him, a scarf wrapped around her face, determination in her eyes. Together they fought the wind to secure a tarpaulin over the damaged section. Yates was amazed at her strength, at how she worked alongside him without complaint despite the bitter cold numbing their fingers. Back in the cabin, as they huddled before the fire trying to restore warmth to their frozen limbs, he looked at her with new eyes. Her face was flushed from exertion and cold, her hair had come loose from its pins, and her dress was damp with melted snow. Yet somehow she appeared more alive, more present than the composed young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach. "You didn't have to help," he said finally. Beatrice gave him a level look. "Those animals depend on you, you depend on them. Their welfare is now part of my concern as well." Why? The question escaped before he could stop it. "Because I'm here, Mr. Xander. For better or worse, I'm here." She held his gaze steadily. "And despite your reservations, despite whatever you wrote in a letter I never received, I intend to stay." The simple declaration hung between them, challenging everything Yates had convinced himself was true about his life on the frontier. He had no response that wouldn't reveal how deeply her words had affected him. Instead, he rose and added another log to the fire, watching the flames leap higher. "You should rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow will likely be more of the same." But as he prepared to brave the cold walk to the barn for another night, Beatrice's voice stopped him at the door. "Mr. Xander, Yates. This cabin is large enough for both of us to sleep with propriety intact. I can take the floor near the fire. There's no sense in you risking pneumonia out of some misplaced sense of chivalry." Her use of his given name struck him as intimately as a touch. "That wouldn't be proper. Nor is allowing you to freeze to death when there's a perfectly reasonable alternative." Her tone brooked no argument. "We are adults, not children. I trust we can manage one night under the same roof, without compromising anyone's virtue." Faced with her practical logic and the prospect of another frigid night in the barn, Yates reluctantly agreed. They arranged a makeshift pallet of blankets near the fire, and he insisted she take the bed while he took the floor. As they settled into an uneasy silence, the wind's howl seemed to underscore the strangeness of their situation. "Good night, Mr. Xander," came her soft voice from the darkness. "Good night, Miss Whitman," he replied, staring up at the ceiling, acutely aware of her presence just a few feet away. Sleep seemed impossible with her so near, yet eventually exhaustion claimed him, and he drifted off to the sound of her steady breathing mingling with the crackling fire. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, revealing a transformed landscape blanketed in pristine white. Yates spent the morning digging paths to the barn and checking on the livestock, while Beatrice took inventory of their dwindling supplies. "We'll need to make a trip to River Bend soon," he informed her as he stamped snow from his boots at the doorway. "We're running low on flour and coffee." Beatrice nodded, making notes in a small book she'd produced from her trunk. "I've made a list. With your permission, I could begin organizing your provisions more efficiently. I noticed your shelves could use some attention." Yates felt a flicker of defensiveness, then realized she was right. His system of storage, if it could be called that, consisted mainly of placing items wherever they fit. "You're welcome to try," he said with a shrug, "though I doubt there's much improvement to be made in a place this size." To his surprise, by midday she had transformed his chaotic shelves into an organized display of neatly arranged supplies. Jars of preserves stood in tidy rows, tools hung from newly installed hooks, and even his sparse collection of books had been arranged by subject. "How did you manage all this?" he asked, impressed despite himself. Beatrice smiled, a genuine expression that lit her face in a way he hadn't seen before. "I ran my father's household for years. Organization was necessary with limited resources." She hesitated, then added, "I hope I haven't overstepped." "No," he assured her quickly, "it's an improvement." Her smile widened, and Yates felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. For a moment he could almost imagine what it might be like to come home to this every day, to order and comfort and her quiet presence. The thought alarmed him so much that he abruptly announced he needed to check the fence line and disappeared for the remainder of the afternoon. When he returned, cold and hungry as dusk approached, the cabin was filled with the aroma of cooking. Beatrice had prepared a stew from their limited supplies, somehow coaxing flavor from ingredients that in his hands would have produced something merely edible. "You didn't need to cook," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "I enjoy it," she replied simply, "and we both need to eat." They shared the meal at his small table, and for the first time, conversation flowed between them without awkwardness. Beatrice asked thoughtful questions about the ranch, listening intently as Yates explained his plans for expansion come spring. In turn, he found himself curious about her life in Boston, surprised by her frank descriptions of the society she'd left behind. "Most would consider you mad for abandoning civilization for this," he remarked as they finished eating. Beatrice's expression grew pensive. "Civilization, as you call it, had little left to offer me. After my parents died, I quickly discovered the fragility of social position. Former friends became distant acquaintances. Invitations dwindled. My aunt made it quite clear that at 20, I was rapidly approaching spinsterhood with no dowry to recommend me." "So you chose a stranger in the wilderness instead," Yates said, still struggling to understand. "I chose possibility," she corrected gently, "a chance to build something rather than slowly fade into dependence and obscurity." Her gaze met his across the table. "Not so different from what brought you west, I imagine." The insight startled him. She was right, he had come west seeking exactly that, possibility. The chance to create something that was entirely his own, answerable to no one. Yet somewhere along the way, that vision had narrowed to mere survival. "We should reach River Bend tomorrow if the weather holds," he said, changing the subject. "Once there, if you wish to arrange passage back east, I would understand. I have some savings, enough to see you comfortably return to Boston." Beatrice set down her spoon, her expression unreadable. "Is that what you want, Mr. Xander, for me to return east?" The question hung between them, deceptively simple yet impossibly complex. 4 days ago the answer would have been an unequivocal yes. Now, looking at her across the table, Yates found himself hesitating. "I want you to be certain," he said finally. "This life, it's not what you're accustomed to. It will never be easy." "Few worthwhile things are," she replied. Her steady gaze held his, unwavering. "I made my choice when I boarded the train in Boston, Mr. Xander. I have not changed my mind." That night, as they again prepared for sleep with Yates on the floor and Beatrice in the bed, he found himself wondering what it was she saw in him, or in this place, that made her so determined to stay. More troubling was the realization that he was no longer certain he wanted her to go. River Bend was bustling with activity when they arrived the next day. The holiday had passed, but the settlement was still recovering from the storm, with townspeople clearing snow and repairing minor damage. Yates helped Beatrice down from the wagon, acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. "Folks here don't see many new faces," he explained quietly, "especially not." "Women," she supplied with a small smile. "Eastern women," he clarified. "There are a few families scattered about, mostly Norwegian and German immigrants. Mrs. Henderson at the trading post, the preacher's wife." As if summoned by mention of her name, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway of her establishment. "Yates Xander, thought the storm might have buried you out at that lonely ranch of yours." Her sharp eyes took in Beatrice with undisguised curiosity. "Miss Whitman, a pleasure to see you again. I trust you're settling in well." Before Beatrice could answer, the older woman had ushered them both inside, peppering them with questions and observations. Yates watched with something like amusement as Beatrice handled the interrogation with graceful deflection. It occurred to him that her Boston upbringing had prepared her well for such social maneuvering. While Beatrice selected supplies with Mrs. Henderson's assistance, Yates stepped outside to speak with the blacksmith about repairs to his plow. He was discussing costs when he overheard a conversation between two men loading a wagon nearby. "That's Xander's mail-order bride," one said in a carrying whisper. "Won't last a month out there. Too fine for frontier life." "Reckon he'll be burying her before spring," the other agreed. "Remember the Peterson woman, hung herself in the barn after her second winter, couldn't stand the isolation." Anger flared hot in Yates' chest. He turned, ready to confront the gossip-mongers, when a hand caught his arm. It was Reverend Thomas, the settlement's preacher and occasional doctor. "Let it go, Yates," the older man advised quietly. "People will talk. It's the nature of small places." Yates reluctantly stepped back, but the men's words had lodged beneath his skin like thorns. Was that Beatrice's fate if she stayed? Slow deterioration until the wilderness claimed her too. When she emerged from the trading post, her arms laden with carefully selected purchases, the sunlight caught in her hair, turning it to honey gold. Something twisted in Yates' chest at the sight, a painful awareness that he was already growing accustomed to her presence, already anticipating the quiet companionship of their evenings together. Mr. Xander, Beatrice had approached while he was lost in thought. Is everything all right? He forced a neutral expression. Fine, just discussing business with the blacksmith. Her eyes, perceptive as always, suggested she didn't entirely believe him, but she didn't press. Mrs. Henderson has invited us to stay for dinner. Apparently, there's to be a small gathering tonight, nothing elaborate, just the settlement coming together after the storm. We should head back, Yates said quickly. Daylight's valuable this time of year. It's barely noon, Beatrice pointed out, and I believe it might be beneficial for me to meet some of the local families, unless you object. Put that way, he could hardly refuse without seeming unreasonable. Of course not, if you wish to stay, we'll stay. The gathering turned out to be larger than Mrs. Henderson had indicated. Nearly every resident of River Bend crowded into the back room of the trading post, drawn as much by curiosity about the newcomer as by the promise of company after the isolating storm. Yates watched as Beatrice navigated the attention with remarkable poise, speaking easily with the immigrant wives about their gardens and home remedies, listening attentively to the preacher's wife discuss the challenges of education on the frontier. She's a natural, Reverend Thomas commented, appearing at Yates' side with 2 mugs of hot cider. Not at all what I expected from an Eastern City woman. Yates accepted the cider with a nod of thanks. She's surprising. I imagined so. The older man's eyes were knowing. When Hank mentioned you were meeting a mail-order bride, I confess I had my doubts. Never took you for the type to send away for a wife. It wasn't like that, Yates found himself explaining. I wrote once, months ago, never expected anything to come of it. Yet here she is, Thomas observed. Some might call that providence. Across the room, Beatrice laughed at something Mrs. Henderson said, the sound bright and unaffected. Several of the women had gathered around her, their usual reserve melting in the face of her genuine interest in their lives. She deserves better than what I can offer, Yates said quietly. The Reverend considered this. Perhaps that's for her to decide, he clapped Yates on the shoulder. My Sarah came west as a banker's daughter from Philadelphia. Everyone said she'd wither out here. 23 years later, she still wakes up loving this land and the life we've built. You can't always predict what will take root in new soil. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Yates found himself drawn into conversation with the other ranchers and farmers, discussing spring planting and the latest news from the territorial capital. It was the most socializing he'd done in months, possibly years, and to his surprise, he didn't mind it. Occasionally, his eyes would seek out Beatrice, finding reassurance in her presence across the room. When they finally prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson pressed a package into Beatrice's hands. Just some preserves and sewing notions, she explained, and you must promise to visit again soon. It does these old bones good to see a fresh face. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them tired from the day's activities. As the first stars appeared in the clear night sky, Beatrice broke the silence. They're good people, she said softly, different from what I'm accustomed to, but good. Yates nodded. Frontier life breeds a certain kind of person. Those who can't adapt don't last long. And you think I won't adapt? There was no offense in her tone, only curiosity. He glanced at her profile, silvered by moonlight. I think you're already proving me wrong about many things, Miss Whitman. A small smile played at her lips. I believe that's the closest thing to a compliment you've paid me, Mr. Xander. As they approached the darkened cabin, Yates felt a strange sense of homecoming he hadn't experienced before. The sight of his modest ranch no longer represented just hard-won solitude, it now held the possibility of something more. Something he had convinced himself he neither wanted nor deserved. That night, as they settled into their now familiar sleeping arrangements, Beatrice spoke from the darkness. Thank you for today, she said quietly. for allowing me to meet your neighbors, for not insisting I return east immediately." Yates stared up at the ceiling, his thoughts in turmoil. "You're welcome," he managed, unable to articulate the more complex emotions stirring within him. Sleep eluded him for hours as he wrestled with the growing awareness that his carefully constructed isolation was crumbling, and that some part of him welcomed its fall. January settled over the territory with brutal cold, but inside the cabin, a tentative warmth was growing. They established routines together, dividing the endless work of frontier survival. Beatrice proved herself capable and quick to learn, taking over management of the cabin's interior while Yates handled the livestock and outdoor maintenance. To his surprise, she showed interest in every aspect of ranch operations, often accompanying him to the barn to help with morning chores or asking thoughtful questions about cattle breeding and crop rotation. Her practical intelligence impressed him. She never romanticized the difficulties, simply approached each challenge methodically. 2 weeks after her arrival, a new storm forced them inside for days. This time, the confinement felt less awkward, their silences comfortable rather than strained. In the evenings, Beatrice had taken to reading aloud from one of the few books Yates owned, a collection of essays on animal husbandry that became unexpectedly entertaining through her expressive delivery. "Listen to this," she said one night, laughter in her voice. "The discerning rancher must observe his bull's temperament with the same critical eye he would apply to a potential wife's disposition." She looked up, eyes twinkling. "Sage advice, wouldn't you agree?" Yates found himself chuckling, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. Old Johnson never married, so I'm not sure how qualified he was on that count. Perhaps his expertise with bulls made human females too intimidating by comparison, Beatrice suggested with mock seriousness, and they both dissolved into laughter. It was during these moments, unexpected bursts of shared humor or quiet conversations by firelight, that Yates felt walls within him starting to crumble. For years he had convinced himself that attachment was weakness, that isolation was the only safe path on the frontier. Yet Beatrice's presence was slowly revealing the poverty of that belief. One morning in late January, Yates returned from checking the cattle to find Beatrice standing in the doorway of the cabin, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, scanning for signs of damage or injury. "Nothing's wrong," she assured him, "but I received this." She held out a letter that must have been delivered while he was out with the herd. "It's from my cousin in Boston. Apparently, she's been trying to locate me for weeks." Yates felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "What does she want?" Beatrice's fingers tightened on the paper. "My father's former business partner has experienced an unexpected reversal of fortune. He's offering to honor an old arrangement, a marriage proposal I refused last year." The world seemed to tilt beneath Yates' feet. "I see," he managed, though he felt suddenly hollow. "And you wish to accept?" Her eyes flashed up to his, surprise evident. "No, of course not, I merely thought you should know." Relief flooded through him, so powerful it left him momentarily speechless. When he found his voice, it emerged rougher than intended. "Your life is your own, Beatrice. I have no claim on your decisions." Something like hurt crossed her features. "No claim," she repeated softly. "After all, we are merely two strangers sharing accommodations out of necessity." "That's not what I meant," Yates said, frustrated by his inability to express the tumult of emotions her announcement had triggered. "Then what did you mean?" she challenged, a new fire in her eyes. "In the weeks I've been here, you've never once indicated whether you consider our arrangement temporary or something else. I've respected your reticence, your need for space, but I cannot continue in this uncertainty indefinitely." Her directness caught him off guard. "What do you want from me, Beatrice?" "Honesty," she said simply. "Do you wish me to stay?" "Not as a convenient housekeeper or temporary companion, but as someone with whom you might build a future." The question stripped away all pretense, all the careful distance he had maintained. Yates looked at her, really looked, and saw the courage it had taken for her to speak so plainly. She stood before him, this remarkable woman who had traveled across a continent based on the promise of a letter, who had adapted to frontier hardship without complaint, who had somehow begun to heal parts of him he thought permanently broken. Yes, he admitted finally, the truth wrung from somewhere deep inside him. I want you to stay, but I fear what this place might do to you, what I might do to you. Beatrice stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. What do you mean? Everyone I've ever loved has been taken from me, Yates said, the words painful in his throat. My mother to fever, my father to grief. My childhood friend to an Apache raid. This land devours the weak and punishes those who dare to care too deeply. Understanding dawned in her expression. So you decided it was safer not to care at all. Wouldn't you, he demanded, if everything you loved turned to dust in your hands? I already have, she said quietly. I lost my parents, my home, my position in society, everything I thought defined me. Yet here I stand, still capable of caring, still believing that connection is worth the risk of loss. She reached out, her fingers lightly touching his arm. Isolation isn't safety, Yates. It's merely a slower kind of death. Her touch, even through the layers of his coat, sent warmth spreading through him. The truth of her words resonated with something long buried, a knowledge he had been running from since his father's death. He had convinced himself that solitude was strength, but standing before this woman who had endured losses equal to his own yet remained open to life, he suddenly saw his isolation for what it was, not strength but fear. Before he could respond, the distant sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Visitors were rare, especially in the depths of winter. Yates moved to the door, instinctively positioning himself between Beatrice and whatever was coming. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, moving steadily toward the cabin. As they drew closer, Yates recognized the lead rider with a jolt of surprise. Marshal Taylor, he said, tension evident in his voice. Beatrice came to stand beside him. Is something wrong? The territorial marshal rarely makes social calls, Yates replied grimly. Stay inside. But Beatrice remained in the doorway as the riders approached. Marshal Jim Taylor was a hard-faced man with eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. He nodded curtly in greeting. Xander, been a while. Marshal, Yates kept his tone neutral. What brings you out this way? Taylor's gaze shifted to Beatrice, then back to Yates. Tracking a fugitive. Bank robber named Carter passed through River Bend 2 days ago. Trail leads this direction. He paused, studying Yates with uncomfortable intensity. Mind if we take a look around? Every instinct warned Yates to refuse, but that would only raise suspicion. Help yourself. Haven't seen any strangers. As the marshal and his deputies dismounted and began searching the outbuildings, Beatrice moved closer to Yates. Who is Carter? She asked quietly. Yates' jaw tightened. A ghost from the past. Someone I rode with years ago, before I settled here. The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, but to his surprise, no judgment followed. Before you settled here, she repeated thoughtfully. People change. Her simple acceptance of his past, a past he had never fully disclosed to anyone, left him momentarily speechless. Before he could respond, Marshal Taylor returned from the barn, his expression grim. Found fresh tracks leading north from your property, he informed them. Carter's not traveling alone. Seems he's gathered a new gang. His sharp eyes assessed Yates. You sure you haven't seen him? You two were thick as thieves once. That was a long time ago, Yates said evenly. I've had no contact with Carter in years. Taylor seemed unconvinced but nodded anyway. We'll continue north. If he circles back this way, you send word immediately. Carter's dangerous, killed a man in that bank job. As the lawman rode away, the silence between Yates and Beatrice grew heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, she broke it. You were an outlaw, she said quietly. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Yates met her gaze, unwilling to hide from the truth any longer. For 2 years after my father died, I was angry, reckless, rode with Carter and his gang robbing stagecoaches and rustling cattle. Never killed anyone, but I didn't stop those who did. He gestured to the ranch around them. Everything here was built with honest work, trying to make amends for those years. He waited for her shock, her disappointment, her decision to return east after all. Instead, Beatrice surprised him yet again. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. "The past shapes us, but it doesn't define us, not unless we allow it to." The acceptance in her words loosened something tight in Yates' chest. For years he had carried his past like a secret burden, convinced that redemption was a solitary path. Now, standing before this woman who saw him clearly yet chose to see beyond his mistakes, he felt the first true hope that perhaps the future could be different from the past. "Beatrice," he began, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions her presence had awakened in him. But before he could continue, the distant crack of a rifle split the air, followed by shouts and more gunfire. Yates reacted instantly, pulling Beatrice inside the cabin and reaching for his own rifle. "Stay here," he ordered, checking that the weapon was loaded. "Bar the door behind me." "What's happening?" Alarm widened her eyes. "Sounds like the marshal found Carter," Yates explained grimly. "Or Carter found him." "You can't go out there," Beatrice protested, catching his arm. "It isn't your fight." Yates paused, struck by the concern in her voice, the fear for his safety. "I know these hills better than Taylor. If Carter's gang has ambushed them, they'll need help." He covered her hand with his own. "I'm not the man I was, Beatrice. I can't stand by while men die when I might prevent it." Understanding dawned in her expression, followed by reluctant acceptance. "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," he insisted. "I can shoot," she informed him with surprising firmness. "My father believed every woman should know how to defend herself. I won't stay here alone wondering if you're dead or alive." There was no time to argue. The gunfire had intensified, coming from the ridge to the north of the property. With a curse, Yates grabbed his spare revolver and handed it to her. "Stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you run. No questions." They moved quickly across the snow-covered ground toward the sounds of battle. As they crested a small rise, the scene below became clear. Marshal Taylor and one deputy were pinned down behind a cluster of boulders, exchanging fire with 4 men positioned among the trees across the small valley. The second deputy lay motionless in the open, clearly dead. Yates assessed the situation with experienced eyes. "Carter's men have the high ground. They'll pick off Taylor and his man eventually." "What can we do?" Beatrice asked, her voice steady despite the danger. "Circle around behind them," Yates decided. "There's a deer trail through those trees. If we can approach from their flank, we might be able to even the odds." Moving carefully, they began working their way through the snow-laden pines. Yates was acutely aware of Beatrice behind him, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. She moved with remarkable quietness, following his lead without hesitation. They had nearly reached a position behind the outlaws when a twig snapped beneath Beatrice's foot. One of the gunmen spun toward the sound, his rifle rising. Yates fired first, his shot catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. The ambush discovered, they had no choice but to press the advantage. "Take cover," Yates shouted to Beatrice, pushing her toward a fallen log as bullets splintered the trees around them. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire. Marshal Taylor and his remaining deputy, hearing the new commotion, renewed their attack from the front while Yates engaged from the rear. Caught in a crossfire, 2 more of Carter's men fell. In the momentary lull that followed, a voice called out from among the trees. "Yates Xander, never thought I'd see you riding with the law." "Carter," the voice was instantly recognizable, carrying the same mocking edge Yates remembered from years before. "It's over, Carter," he shouted back. "Taylor's called for reinforcements. There's no way out." A harsh laugh answered him. "Always was a bad liar, Yates, but I've got a proposition for you. Let me ride out, and I won't put a bullet in that pretty woman hiding behind the log." Ice flooded Yates' veins as he realized Carter had spotted Beatrice. He risked a glance toward where she had taken cover and saw with horror that she was indeed visible from Carter's position. "You touch her, you're a dead man," Yates promised, every word weighted with lethal intent. Touching sentiments from the man who swore he'd never be shackled to a woman, Carter taunted. How quickly principles change. The distraction of their exchange gave Marshal Taylor the opportunity he needed. A shot rang out from the marshal's position, followed by a cry of pain. Carter staggered into view, blood spreading across his side. Yates seized the moment, breaking cover and closing the distance to his former friend, rifle trained on Carter's chest. "Drop the gun," he ordered, voice cold. Carter, pale with pain and blood loss, nonetheless managed his familiar sardonic smile. "You've gone soft, Yates. The frontier will eat you alive." His eyes flickered past Yates to where Beatrice had emerged from cover. "Both of you." The gun, Carter, now. With a final defiant glare, Carter let his weapon fall to the snow. As Yates moved to secure him, the outlaw suddenly lunged, drawing a hidden knife from his boot. Yates twisted away, but not quickly enough. The blade sliced across his arm, tearing through coat and flesh. He stumbled backward, losing his grip on the rifle. Carter advanced, knife raised for a killing strike. The report of a gun split the air, but it wasn't from Taylor's position. Beatrice stood 10 yards away, Yates' revolver steady in her hands. Carter crumpled to his knees, a look of surprise frozen on his face as he pitched forward into the snow. In the sudden silence that followed, Yates could hear only the pounding of his own heart and Beatrice's ragged breathing. She lowered the gun slowly, her face pale but composed. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady for someone who had just taken a life. Yates nodded, pressing his hand to the bleeding gash on his arm. "Thanks to you." Marshal Taylor appeared, his deputy supporting him as he limped across the bloodied snow. He surveyed the scene with grim satisfaction. "Seems I owe you both a debt," he acknowledged. Carter's reign of terror is finally over. As Taylor's deputy began securing the sole surviving outlaw, Beatrice moved to Yates' side, gently examining his wounded arm. "This needs tending," she said softly, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind the injury temporarily. Yates watched her methodical movements, struck by the calm courage she had displayed. "You saved my life," he said, still processing the reality of it. Beatrice met his gaze, something fierce and uncompromising in her blue eyes, "and I would do it again without hesitation." Her hand stilled on his arm. "I may have been raised in Boston drawing rooms, Yates Xander, but I am not made of porcelain. I will not shatter at the first sign of frontier hardship." In that moment, with her standing bloodied but unbowed in the snow, having just killed a man to protect him, Yates finally understood the truth. The frontier might indeed be merciless, but it did not preclude love, perhaps it even demanded it. Survival alone was not enough, it never had been. "Marry me," he said abruptly, the words escaping before he could reconsider them. Beatrice's eyes widened in surprise. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, more certain this time. "Not because of a letter or an arrangement or convenience. Marry me because I've been a fool thinking I could face this life alone, that isolation was somehow safer than risking my heart." He took her hands in his, heedless of the blood and snow. "I love you, Beatrice Whitman. I think I began loving you that first day when you stepped off the stagecoach and faced this wilderness without flinching." For a moment she simply stared at him, and Yates feared he had misread everything. Then a smile broke across her face, radiant despite the grim surroundings. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Yates Xander, not because I need a protector or provider, but because I love you too, your strength and your vulnerability, your past and your present." Her smile turned wry. "Even your stubborn belief that caring for others is somehow a weakness rather than the greatest strength we possess." Marshal Taylor cleared his throat awkwardly, reminding them they were not alone. "If you two are finished, we should get the wounded back to town. Reverend Thomas can see to that arm and perform a wedding if you're of a mind." Yates looked at Beatrice, suddenly aware of how strange a proposal this had been, surrounded by death in the blood-stained snow. "I'm sorry, this isn't how I would have chosen to ask. You deserve better." Her laugh was unexpected and beautiful. "On the contrary," she said, her eyes bright with a mixture of tears and joy, "this is perfectly fitting. We met on Christmas morning when you could barely speak. We'll be married after surviving our first battle together. What could be more appropriate for a frontier love story?" As they made their way back toward the cabin, supporting the wounded marshal between them, Yates felt a sense of rightness that had eluded him for years. The path ahead would not be easy. The frontier would continue to challenge them with every season, but they would face it together, stronger for their partnership than either could be alone. The mail-order bride had indeed arrived on Christmas morning, and the cowboy had barely been able to speak. But now, words flowed between them as naturally as the creek that would thaw with spring's arrival, nourishing the land they would build together, not just a ranch, but a home.